Hey guys, what's up? JK with PornReboot here, and today I want to talk about sexual fantasies. Sexual fantasies are one of the most private parts of our lives. Before high-speed internet porn, sexual fantasy was already something that was rarely brought up in public. Even most couples, no matter how close they were, couples rarely discussed their deepest sexual fantasies. And one of the reasons is a problem that we usually have with sexual fantasies, and that's our ability as human beings to feel that our fantasies are something that we actually want. So because we can imagine it vividly, we feel like it would be amazing to experience it. And because we think that it's something that we want to experience, we assume that talking about it to others will make them assume that we want that. And this is why it's so challenging to speak about our sexual fantasies, because some of them may not be things that are accepted in polite society. So one of the questions I get a lot is, how do I get rid of my sexual fantasies? And the very simple answer to that is that you can't. Yeah, I said that. You cannot get rid of your sexual fantasies, but you can manage them. I'll tell you why. When I work with a client, they sometimes come to me in the early stages of their porn addiction, when they haven't acted out on any of their fantasies, or maybe when they haven't watched pornography for a few weeks or a few months. And the moment that they start coaching with me, suddenly their fantasies and their urges increase drastically. Now, this is because when you're told, or when it's even implied, that you should not think about something, there's a natural tendency to actually think about it even more. And in the case of sexual fantasies, these fantasies can become more frequent and they can become more persistent when it's implied that you shouldn't think about them. So the lesson from that is, never try to deal with your sexual fantasies by not thinking of them, as there's a risk that they will become even stronger. Sexual fantasies are a normal part of human life. They are things that we do to kind of escape from our reality, and there's a reason we have that ability. But they only become a problem when you start to make it a huge deal, when you start to make this big effort to control them or get obsessive and start worrying about them. Another time when sexual fantasies become a big problem is when you start to make them more elaborate. So porn is a shortcut to having detailed fantasies. Now, you may have a specific fantasy that was normal and maybe even healthy to have, but out of curiosity, you decided to search for this fantasy on a porn website. And you started masturbating to it, and you gradually found that online there are more variations of this fantasy. Over time, what happens is that your original fantasy morphs into a fantasy which is dictated by the standards of pornography. And when you get to this point, that's when it might begin to affect your life. Some might argue and say, you know what, my fantasy just stays online. It stays in porn land. I would never act out on it. Now, if you're struggling with a porn addiction, a lot of times you don't act out on your fantasy simply because there's no equivalent for that fantasy in the real world. And if you were to look into the lives of people who are addicted to pornography, who make statements like this, you would find that they are not having sex with their partners, or that they've lost their sexual attraction to their partner, or that they feel that the person they're with or women that they date are not adventurous enough. Sometimes I'll even hear them say, you know what, I have a very high sex drive and my partner is boring. Your sex drive does not have that much to do with your sexual fantasies. These are just excuses by someone who can't fulfill their fantasy in real life, and this destroys relationships. I'm specifically referring to porn addicts. What happens when porn has escalated the level of your sexual fantasy and has made it so elaborate that it's something important in your life is that it makes it impossible for you to enjoy your sexual life, because they simply aren't a normal people walking around that share your fantasy. Now, what if you don't have access to sex? What if you can't have sex on a regular basis? Maybe you haven't figured out how to get to that stage. Maybe your values or your religion or your culture prevents you from doing that, or something else. Well, what can you do in this case? You can still fantasize, because fantasies are normal, as I've mentioned before. And like I said, there is a reason why we have the capability to do so. However, if your fantasies begin to seep into your life, they become a problem. Now, there are so many men out there whose expectations of life have been defined by fantasies, especially from pornography. Everywhere you look, you don't see attractive women. You only see women who don't live up to your standard. And the funny thing is, many of these men are not even having sex. You know, that's the hilarious part. That's the funny part. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens when your fantasies get out of control, when they become a serious issue. And it's not necessarily when you have a fantasy multiple times a day. You'd be surprised at how often people who are not addicted to pornography or masturbation fantasize about sex. No, your fantasies begin to have real-world consequences when you start planning them. The only way you can begin planning to act out a fantasy is when you begin to become obsessed with it. And obsessiveness is when you think about it all day long, non-stop, to the point that it's interrupting your day-to-day activities. Now, if you've reached that stage, or if you've been in that stage for a while, I have a solution for you. For every fantasy that you act out, for every fantasy that you bring into the world, realize that there is a price to pay. So let's say that you fantasized about having anal sex and you've never done it before. So after planning various ways to make this happen, you finally decide that what you're going to do is that you're going to ask your partner if she would be into it. Let's say she says, no, that's not going to happen. I'm not into that. So you get rejected. Now that's a low price to pay, a little bit of rejection. Now let's say you have a fantasy of having sex with a transgender she-male person. Because your only interest in this demographic is created by porn and fantasy, you don't really know how to go about meeting someone who could help you fulfill this. You know, so you go online and you search, and then you decide, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pay a transgender prostitute. Now, the question is, what is the possible price that you could end up paying in a situation like this? Well, you could be arrested for soliciting a prostitute. You could contract an STD like HIV, or you could end up in a shady situation that maybe gets you robbed, or worst case scenario, killed. And that really happens, guys. All in all, it's a high price to pay, okay? Now, don't just think of the cost to you. Think of the cost to the other parties involved. So for instance, you know, let's assume you're a married man, okay? What would be the impact on your wife if she were to find out that her husband had sex with a transgender prostitute? What would your community think when word goes around, or when your mugshot, you know, shows up in one of those gas stations, you know, look who was arrested this weekend, you know, publications? What if you contracted something and passed it on to your partner? Think of other people. When we are taken over by our addict and we get into this fantasy world, we rarely think about others. And I'm trying to get you to learn how to do that. Now let's take it a step further. Let's go all the way. Some of you out there fantasize about having sex with a child or someone below the age of consent. And I don't give a fuck whether it's hentai or not, okay? There's a video on hentai on this channel, actually, where you can jump into the comments and join the hentai is the hentai is not porn deniers club. If you ever find yourself planning something like this, having sex with a child, trying to make that fantasy something in the real world, consider the price the child has to pay. Many children who were sexually abused grow up to experience a range of mental health issues and serious addictions. You could go to prison, probably will go to prison, and die, and ruin your entire life. The price in this case is not even worth it, because the price keeps increasing over time. It compounds. So to keep your porn fantasies from getting to the planning stage, what I would like you to do, here's an exercise, write out the price of each of these fantasies if acted out in real life. And if you find that you're at a point where you have already acted out, or you've been in the planning stage for a long time, seriously consider the price you will pay and reach out to someone to help you, or at the very least, get access to helpful resources for your problem. All right? So that's it, guys. I gotta go. This is our episode for today. I'm JK, your brother in this struggle. I wish you all the best in your recovery from your porn addiction. If you found this video helpful, subscribe. If you need to reach out to me and email me, it's jkemezi@elevatedrecovery.org. I also have a live webinar this Thursday called The 7 Secrets of Porn-Free Men, and I'll be glad if you could join me on that. Have an awesome day.